We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. These, of course, are the 7 shared principles of our faith. When Melissa and Ron Hutchison won the chance to pick a sermon topic in this year's service auction, it was the 7th tradition, that of global environmental stewardship, where they thought to focus my attention. As many of you know, Melissa and Ron are quite conscientious about the impact their lives have on the planet. They strive to minimize their carbon footprint at home and in their public lives. They walk where they can, bike where they can, and drive electric automobiles. Their house is powered with solar panels and heated with a geothermal system, and there is a very impressive and complex composting toilet system to minimize the amount of wastewater their home produces. It's very impressive. And finally, a significant part of their commitment to environmental stewardship is their adherence to a plant-based diet. And that's the part of our 7th tradition that they wanted me to address. The moral imperative for Unitarian Universalists to adopt plant-based diets as part of our practice to live out our values. This, they told me, was foundational to how humans may be able to stop or slow climate change and preserve our planet. And that is how this affirmed omnivore comes to stand before you this morning to talk about veganism as a tool with which to affirm our principles. Work with me. I was fully prepared to search high and low for obscure studies funded by non-neutral organizations making radical claims about the virtues of veganism. What I was not prepared for was to read in the UK Independent about a study done at Oxford University and published last year in the journal Science. The scholarly article was authored by 2 respected scientists who cited hundreds of other independent studies of thousands of agricultural facilities and processes, and came to the conclusion that, in fact, adopting a vegan diet was the single most impactful thing a person can do to slow global climate change. That was not convenient. The author of the article in The Independent, Olivia Petter, wrote, quote, "Eating a vegan diet could be the single biggest way to reduce your environmental impact on Earth, a new study suggests. Researchers at the University of Oxford found that cutting meat and dairy products from your diet could reduce an individual's carbon footprint from food by up to 73%. Meanwhile, if everyone stopped eating these foods, they found that global farmland use could be reduced by 75%, an area equivalent to the size of the United States, China, Australia, and the EU combined. Not only would this result in a significant drop in greenhouse gas emissions, but it would also free up wild land lost to agriculture, which is one of the primary causes for mass wildlife extinction." Well then, that certainly was not the kind of evidence I was expecting, and certainly not what I was hoping. The study itself was breathtakingly comprehensive. When I downloaded the article in PDF form, it was nearly 150 pages long. And more than 100 of those pages were taken up entirely with citations of past articles and studies and experiments and documentation. The two scientists, Joseph Poore and Thomas Nemechek, looked at 570 studies of 38,700 farms and 1,600 facilities that processed, packaged, and sold a wide range of agricultural products, all kinds of agricultural products, ranging from farmed fish to apples, soybeans, grains, beef, pork, dairy, poultry, eggs, and rice. Researchers examined a total of 40 agricultural products in the study, covering 90% of all food that is eaten by humans globally. And what they found was that dairy and meat production is responsible for nearly 2/3 of agriculture's greenhouse gas. And while those animal-sourced products, because of the expense to produce them, account for less than 20% of all calories consumed by humans globally, and only 1/3 of all of the protein that we eat. So that was a jumbled sentence with a bunch of numbers. Let me try that again. Meat agriculture, animal agriculture, produces 2/3 of all farming greenhouse gases and provides 1/3 of the world's protein for that cost. And the conclusion, according to Poore, was simple. A vegan diet, this is quoting, a vegan diet is probably the single biggest way to reduce your impact on planet Earth. Not just greenhouse gases, but global acidification, eutrophication, land use, and water use. Now, if you're like me and needed to look up eutrophication, it means when water in rivers and streams and lakes and ponds gets super rich in nutrients, and the small cell plant growth gets so thick and so dense that it chokes out the animals that, correct me if I'm wrong, I've got a bunch of science people in here, probably, but it chokes out the other animal life in the water body. Where I grew up in central Maine, there was a place called China Lake, where I have fished many a time. And in the 1980s, China Lake experienced this exact phenomenon. The whole lake was surrounded by tiny little camps that had questionable sewage systems and farmland and suburban and rural lawns. And so all of the nutrients and all of the fertilizer and all of the unthinkables from the septic stuff came into the lake and caused an algae bloom that caused aerial photographs of that lake to look like a putting green. The fish died. Lots of animals died. And this would have been terrible on its own were it not for the fact that China Lake is the municipal water supply for Waterville and Winslow, Maine, community with about 40,000 people. Authorities ended up shocking the lake by poisoning the water to kill off the algae, and it took years for the lake to recover to where it was safe for swimming and other forms of recreation. The bass came back, the trout never will. Bass are stupid and they can adapt. Trout are fussy. Now the struggle in China Lake is milfoil, which is choking out things. But that's a different story. So that's eutrophication. And it, with the others, are the problems associated with livestock and factory farms. Greenhouse gas, global acidification, eutrophication, land use, and water use. Now, since that study came out about a year ago, you can imagine that many people have weighed in with their thoughts about the conclusions. I was eager to put myself among them, I assure you. Now, there's a wide variety of environmental impact from different types of farming. Indoor production of meat, from pork to beef to poultry or eggs, is often the worst environmentally. Between the concentrated waste products of those industries to the vast amount of lands and water needed to grow the feed crops to raise those meat animals. On the other hand, grass-fed, free-range, cage-free meat production could have similarly awful environmental impact in grazing areas or large outdoor poultry facilities. When I lived briefly in Minnesota, I became acquainted with how turkeys were farmed there, specifically Jenny O turkeys. They're grown in large outdoor pens with huge wall-less barn-type structures over them to protect the birds from rain and the sun and generally unpleasant weather. The birds are fed diet, they're like pole barns, right, but without walls. So the birds are fed concentrated nutrition to promote rapid meat and fat production, and the result of that is a lot of waste. Now, several crops of birds will be raised under one consecutive, not at the same time, under one canopy roof until the accumulated manure stacks up to the point where there is very little space between the ground and the eave. Okay? At which point, the next batch of turkeys will be raised under a new barn roof while backhoes remove the compacted manure from beneath the first barn. And the birds will be cycled back there when the other one gets full. That manure is then spread on fields to serve as nitrogen-rich fertilizer, which then, of course, runs off into the local streams and rivers. And here we go round with that fancy word, eutrophication, again. So back to this Oxford University study. According to Poor and Nemechek, a person can cut their food-related carbon footprint by up to 73% by simply cutting meat and dairy from their diet. Additionally, if everyone stopped eating meat and dairy, the study indicated that a global farmland use could be cut by 3/4. Remember that? 3/4. Now, this was not the news I wanted to find. This was not what I wanted at all. Now, to be sure, not all plant-based agriculture is equal. The water necessary to produce almonds and pistachios in California does horrific things to the water table there. And decades of annual droughts have done real damage to the land. Palm oil and the production of palm oil is responsible for the largest destruction to primate habitat on the planet. And yet, on the whole, the science points in one direction, environmentally. That switching to a plant-based diet is the most immediate, significant thing we can do to reduce our personal carbon footprint. Period. Even small-scale family farming have effects on the environment. No, there are no giant waste lagoons on a small dairy farm like there might be in a factory farm in Ohio. But the impact on the local water table is proportionately similar. It's just at a tiny, tiny bit. There's a certain amount, especially with dairy, where I'm from, in Maine, certain amount of land required for grazing, for feeding and watering. You have to grow a lot of grain, and hay to feed the cows in the wintertime. Then you think about gasoline and diesel to transport the products to be processed, and waste products from that process, and then more fuel and resources devoted to packaging and transporting and marketing. So in my conversation with the Hutchisons about the logistics of living a vegan life, we talked about privilege and some of the very real ways that people are challenged in the United States when considering making this switch. For starters, meat and dairy products, because of large-scale agricultural subsidies, are artificially affordable. In the same way it's cheaper to buy junk food than healthy fresh produce, it's also cheaper to buy some meats than other forms of protein. A vegan diet requires resources of one kind or another. Fast and convenient vegan food is far more expensive than your standard drive-through burger meal. Even though McDonald's French fries are now vegan. There's hope. To prepare vegan food at home, one must devote a significant time or money, or sometimes both, to the effort. For those who lack both, say a working family with 2 or 3 jobs, limited transportation and limited money, that's more than they can manage. And that's real. That's real. Living an ethically elevated life is privilege. But to be fair, there are not many of us here today or watching from home on Facebook for whom reducing the amount of meat and dairy, reducing, not eliminating, reducing the amount of meat and dairy products we consume each week would be a significant struggle. It really wouldn't be that tough for most of us. Some families have adopted a meatless day each week to make a step in that direction. If one meatless day can be done, then perhaps 2 meatless days could happen in a week. Now, I confess that I have developed a significant awareness around the amount of meat and dairy I consume in a week. It is an awareness that brings with it discomfort. Because once we know something, we can't unknow it, which is damned inconvenient. Like once we hear lyrics in a favorite hymn that are binary or ableist or exclusive in some other way, singing that hymn just doesn't feel quite the same anymore. Learning uncomfortable and inconvenient truths means we cannot go back to our blissfully ignorant ways. Unitarian Universalists talk not so much about sin and evil as we do about ethics and authenticity. We get our moral authority from our commitment to ethical living, to our authenticity, and to our commitment to honesty and integrity. Now, the premise that Melissa and Ron gave me with this sermon topic was this. They wanted me to explore the environmental impact of animal-based agriculture and see if I came to the same conclusion that they did, that there is a moral imperative for Unitarian Universalists who are committed to living out our 7th principle in a meaningful way to adopt a plant-based diet and lifestyle to the extent that such a thing was possible. And now I am in that uncomfortable place of knowing. I know the science. I dug through the study. I read the references. I know the facts about agriculture and greenhouse gases and eutrophication, which I can now spell, and water and land usage and all the rest. I also know that while our 7 principles are aspirational, they do call us to action. These are not comfortable statements to make us feel all warm and fuzzy and morally superior to others. They are challenges to us to put our money where our mouths are, to walk the walk as much as we talk the talk. Our principles call us to moral authenticity, to live out the things we profess to value. And I am weak. I am stuck between a lifetime of culture and taste and favorites and comfort food and the knowledge of what that stuff is doing to the planet. I am stuck in a place where I do not feel that I have the resources or skills just yet to be able to live a plant-based life. It's complicated. I did teach myself blacksmithing. There are a bunch of weird ingredients and methods I've never tried and tastes I'm not familiar with. I watched a YouTube video last week to learn how to change the oil and spark plug on my generator. I like meat. Okay, that's where it lands, right? That's the thing right there. I don't want to change. I don't want to give up the things I like just because they are in opposition to my espoused values. And that is the foundation of my discomfort. It is human selfishness on my part, I'm not judging anyone else, on my part, that prevents me from making the changes that I know in my mind would be morally correct. I don't want to give up my pleasures. I don't want to give up ice cream. It's a hard limit. Cheeseburgers. Summertime grilling is coming. I love those things. Grilled carrots are not the same, Ron. Now, other changes I have made without too much trouble as I have come into my Unitarian Universalist identity. I got a handle on the Universalist part pretty easy. I like the idea of using reason in church, support the democratic process, support people seeking truth, like the idea of working toward a world with peace and justice and all the rest. And I thought I was good with the seventh tradition. I recycle my newspapers and my bottles and cans. I use reusable bags at the grocery store. I try not to buy too much with excess packaging. I got a car that gets good gas mileage. Planning to get solar panels on my house. But that might not be enough for me to be comfortable in myself. Not now. Now that I know more than I did. And so I am called by my aspirational faith to reach in a direction I had never imagined. I said reach, not go. Toward a more plant-based diet. Like I said, I am weak. I do not imagine I will be able to make such a huge switch immediately, if ever. But I can take some incremental steps. I can go meat-free for 1 or 2 days a week, which may not sound like much, but right now it's 1 or 2 days more than I'm doing. So I can commit to learning new recipes and exploring new ways to prepare food that will be less harmful to the planet. I will try. Moral authenticity does not come from moral perfection or political purity. Moral authenticity means doing as much as we can, when we can, and making progress at the pace our persons can tolerate. Moral authenticity in a complex world requires us to try and to continue trying, knowing that we will fail and being willing to try again. Sometimes our knowledge outstrips our ability to act. For me, this is one of those times. I cannot tell anyone here what to do. You would not listen if I tried. What I can do is ask you to listen, ask you to learn, to think, to be curious, ask questions. I want you to engage in your own free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and explore where that might lead you. This is how we live out our values, imperfectly, but authentically, in fits and starts, bites and bits at a time, ever moving forward, ever seeking, ever learning, ever growing in body and spirit. May this be our shared practice and prayer. Amen.